Well, Clifford, welcome to ATG the podcast. We're very pleased to have you on the podcast today. You've been involved with the Coalition for Network Information for many years. But what we'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about your background, sort of how you got to the coalition, and then a little bit about your role there. So, thank you for joining.
It's great to be here with you.
Excellent. So, when you studied your background, you actually started out doing maths before moving to computing. How did you why did you switch from one to the other?
Well, couple reasons, and you have to remember how long ago that was. I mean, we're talking, I started, college in 72, 1972.
Gosh.
I really had no exposure to computers until like my second year in college.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, I mean, they just weren't a thing for most students in high school at that time. Uh, so it was a mix of just discovering something that was really interesting and also realizing that much as I enjoyed mathematics, I wasn't really sure I wanted to spend my life as a research mathematician.
Sure. Sure. So, but it sounds like very soon after getting involved in computing, you found yourself on a library project, and a very interesting library project at California, doing online catalogs.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I had started about the same time, shortly after I started getting involved in computers. I ran into a professor at Columbia's library school, Theodore Hines, who was doing a lot of work with a language called Snowball 4, a symbolic text and computing language. And through him, I got very interested in a lot of the sort of textual and related applications of computing, which at that time were very esoteric, and connected up with a fellow named Ed Brownrigg, who was at New York University, and went to work for him when I was still in college, doing some library applications there. Then in 19, 1980, give or take, I went with Ed Brownrigg actually to the University of California Office of the President, which was the headquarters for what was at the time the nine-campus system, to build a very large-scale library automation system, basically a union catalog for all of the collections of the University of California's roughly 100 libraries under the slogan, one university, one library. The idea being anyone at any of the campuses could, search the entire collection. And that was, of course, backed up with a whole series of interlibrary loan arrangements and things to physically get material to people. So that was for the time, an enormous project, and really quite innovative. One of the things that's really striking to me about it, even looking back, is that this was about the same time as automatic teller machines were coming into fairly wide deployment. And, if you think about the public's interaction with computers, the first places they were seeing it were ATMs
Mm.
and library catalogs, which was just fascinating. So it was a whole adventure trying to make this kind of thing user accessible. And as we went down the path from there, we moved on to many other things. One of the things we did very early was to make the system accessible not just from in-library terminals, but first from dial-up terminals and then later on from network access. And to open that up, really because it was a public institution in California to the world, which was quite unheard of at the time as well. So we actually had people using the system from all over the globe. It was really quite interesting. As things progressed through the 80s, we also started putting up abstracting and indexing databases. One of the early ones we did, which was very high impact, was to add the National Library of Medicine's Medline database to the system, which again was striking in that it really opened up health information to the public in a way that had never been done before, and at a scale that had never been done before. Let us say it was met with mixed reactions by physicians around California when patients walked in with stacks of article abstracts asking for, well, what about this? But that was, a wonderful experience. We had a great team there. The last thing I'll just mention about the University of California, because it's relevant for a lot of things, is that in order to really deploy that online catalog at the scale we needed a pretty sophisticated computer network. And we actually worked with Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, the original contractor on the ARPANET, to put in a ARPANET-like packet switch network to support this, which became the basis for a lot of the intercampus networking at the University of California. So actually, until I left the university in '97, intercampus networking was essentially a library function that reported to me, a library automation function. So I was really very deeply involved in networks too.
Yeah. It sounds amazing that you sort of this your first involvement with libraries, and you happened to sort of to chance on one of the biggest and still today one of the largest catalogs. The California e-scholarship system is one of the biggest institutions and repositories, and quite amazing, sort of fortuitous to sort of to.
They've continued to be a leader throughout. Yeah, they're wonderful.
Absolutely remarkable.
Done fabulous work.
So do you think that early experience sort of stood you in good stead for your later involvement in CNI?
Yeah, because a lot of what played out through my time at CNI really was outgrowths, extensions, and evolutions of things that got their start back when I was at UC. Network-based computing, the shift to digital content, and then the shift to largely centralized digital content. All of the policy issues around government information on the internet, scholarly publishing on the internet. Many of those things had their roots back then.
So let's talk about the Coalition for Networked Information. You weren't actually the founder, but you were there pretty early on. I think you joined around 1997, but I think it was Paul Evan Peters who started it. What was the basis? What was the idea behind it?
So actually, while I was certainly not the founder, there was a sort of a complex prehistory to the coalition that I was very heavily involved in. The person I worked for a long time at the University of California was a man named Richard West, who was the vice president for administration and had IT and a lot of other things under him. And he had a number of colleagues around the country who were either chief librarians or chief information officers who shared his feeling that there was just a wealth of opportunity that was being opened up in the 1990s by the large-scale rollout of the internet that was going to affect, every facet of higher education activities, teaching, learning, research, libraries, and there were a number of informal groups among those people who got together and ultimately decided to found CNI, and they recruited Paul in as the founding director.
Mm-hmm. And how did you get involved?
Well, I was part of a lot of those discussions.
Mm-hmm.
In that prehistory.
Mm-hmm.
And, when Paul came in, I ran one of the sub-projects. Certainly, he was a good friend, and I worked very closely with him throughout his, well, really, I knew him before CNI,
Mm-hmm.
but I worked with him very closely through his tenure at CNI. And like everybody else, was quite devastated by his sudden and untimely death.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The term coalition sounds almost military. I mean, was it? It sounds like it was a very sort of active idea behind the bringing together of these different groups. Was it? Why the word coalition, which is still not common for groups today?
I think I don't really know exactly the source of that, other than to sort of characterize it along the lines of coalitions of the willing. Really, we didn't want to have what I'd characterize as a membership organization, which was like about representing a sector or something, the way, for example, some library organizations are, but rather to bring together a diverse group of organizations bound by a common interest or a common, vision.
Hmm.
And that's very much what happened. So you see, certainly the predominant membership in CNI is research universities.
Mm-hmm.
But once you start looking beyond that, you very quickly see foundations, government agencies, publishers, technology providers, really quite an assortment of organizations. And if you really go back to the membership as it was in the 90s, it was even more diverse, I would say, because since then we've had an enormous amount of consolidation in the industries sides. If you think about, library automation systems, if you think about publishing, but you've also had some really interesting structural changes. So, for example, if you look in the very early days, companies like Sun, DEC, IBM were represented among our members, Apple, but the way that those companies have engaged with the higher ed sector started changing really dramatically in the 2000s.
Mm. So,
I mean, there were a number of, joint projects that were done between various libraries and companies like DEC or Sun back in the 90s or, early 2000s that we just don't see things like that anymore.
So that's what you mean by networked information, the sort of the working with by working across borders, as it were, with technology providers, institutions, and bringing them all together.
So that's one piece of it. Another piece of it, though, which is very much a product of its times, was if you go back and you look at the early 90s, particularly, there was a lot of, there was still a lot of excitement around uh, standalone PCs. You had phenomena like CD-ROMs. Remember the new papyrus, uh, um, notions of publishing things on physical media that could be plugged into standalone machines.
Mm-hmm.
The whole idea of networking was still very much in flux
Mm.
at that time. And we wanted to put a firm stake in the ground that we believed the future was the network, was network access, using the network to share information, and also using the network to interconnect information.
Mm. That makes sense.
Very much the kind of ideas that subsequently played out in things like Gopher and then ultimately the World Wide Web.
Mhm. You're preaching to the converted here. As the publisher of the first British encyclopedia on CD-ROM, I remember the excitement of just getting
Yeah.
all this stuff on screen. It's just amazing, fascinating. So, so has CNI? You mentioned that it was rather different in the early days. So, and you said you talked about consolidation. So, how do you think CNI today compares with that organisation from the 90s?
Well, I mean, if you look at what we were doing at CNI in the 90s and into the, I don't know, maybe 2005 or so time frame, a tremendous amount of it was, I think you used the term in a prior conversation with me about sort of evangelistic
Mm. Yep.
consultation,
Mhm.
something like that,
Mhm.
which really I thought characterized it beautifully. The amount of time that Paul spent, that I spent, and that other people involved in CNI spent talking to scholarly societies, to research groups, to foundations, to government agencies, just getting them to understand there was this network out there, and here are the kinds of things you can do with it. And you're going to need to think about how this affects your strategies for, disseminating information, collecting information, sharing information, collaboration. Um, I mean, it was a huge lift.
Mm.
The number of organizations that needed to be brought up to speed on that were just stunning.
Mm.
And, every one of them had a slightly different situation.
Mm.
And so it was really very much a question of going out and, talking it through with people where they were and, how it affected the things they most cared about at the time.
Mm.
There was also a whole, enormous subtext of threat to economic models as well, particularly for, some of the scholarly societies which have always had fragile economic models.
Mm. And those sort of threats still exist today, but perhaps we can we can come back to that in a
Oh, sure.
slightly different way. So today CNI is very much a discussion body, perhaps sort of not perhaps a little bit less of the evangelism. How do you how do you facilitate the dialogue and discussion within with your members, which is rather different to the sort of initial evangelism kind of mode?
Well, I think we're a little bit more than a discussion body. I think we certainly are a discussion body.
Mhm.
I think we are sometimes very effective as an incubator for projects that are launched among our members, a place where our members can connect with other like-minded members, find a common problem, uh, set out to do some work on it,
Mhm.
and we can then subsequently serve as a reporting out vehicle for that. a showcase for that. I think, another function we play is very much one of an early warning radar.
Mhm.
I see, a significant part of my role as identifying trends, developments, technologies, issues that need to be on our members' radar for 5 year strategic planning, which is very, very different than almost all of the other organizations I know, which emphasize heavily, stuff you can take home and use right now.
Yes, that sounds that sounds very likely. I remember reading about you described as an oracle in the culture of network information. So clearly, there's a view of CNI as providing some sort of authoritative guidance, sort of awareness, understanding of current trends in an informed way. Do you think that's the case?
We try. We try. And I like to think we've got it, we have a history of getting it mostly right. I mean, if you look at a number of the really important developments,
Hmm.
you will see those reflected as, featured plenaries or similar things
Hmm.
at CNI very, very early on. And, there are some that are still coming to roost. And I would also say, as time has gone on, particularly the last 7 or 8 years, I think we have been focusing a bit more on the research enterprise broadly. CNI had a lot of its roots in collaborations between information technology and libraries. But that conversation now has gotten much broader and much more complicated. And in particular, the whole nature of how we do research is changing in really significant ways. And that's affecting, of course, not just how we do the research, but how we disseminate the results, the collaboration tools around the research, trends like research data management, which is something that CNI has been all over since the turn of the century, and was regarded as a little bit, loony on the topic till around 2015. Um, uh, I mean, I can remember telling people that, in like 2002, 2003, that this was going to be a, major piece of budgetary investment for them. And they're like, no, couldn't happen. Uh, but, it seems to have. So anyway, one that I'm watching very, very closely now is the trend towards automated labs on a large scale. When we first brought CNI back together in person as the pandemic diminished in December 21, the plenary session was a look at something called the Cloud Lab that Carnegie Mellon had just sunk an enormous amount of money into. Basically, an entire, they were working with a company called Emerald Cloud Lab, which was founded by a bunch of CMU graduates and had set up a commercial facility out near San Francisco Airport. And basically, they duplicated that roughly in collaboration with Emerald in a building slightly off campus in Pittsburgh for Carnegie Mellon and other educational institutions in the area, other startups. And, that's gone operational now on a large scale. They were just starting to build it in 21. Now, if you think about the implications of this for everything from the way it changes the balance of capital and operating expenses for faculty in the science, all the way through issues around productivity, utilization of equipment. It's a real game changer.
Mm.
And of course, interfaces very neatly on one side into research data management infrastructure, the whole set of trends around scientific reproducibility and clear documentation of scientific research. And it's very amenable if you want to put machine learning things in the loop to semi-autonomous robotic research. So we've had that very strongly on our radar screen since 21. And the reactions were everything from, I got to go back and talk to my provost about this right now. We need to be thinking about what this means, all the way through. I have no idea what this has to do with my institution and my library. But I feel like, we did this is exactly what we should be doing, is getting, carefully selected key developments like this on people's radar screens early.
Absolutely. Do you think that the relatively small size of CNI, you have around 200 members, has enabled that kind of focused development to take place? If you compare it with major events like the Charleston Conference that we're both familiar with, you get thousands of attendees, much larger scale, but very different in sort of tone and focus. Do you think that small, that relatively small number of members facilitates the kind of joint development that you've described?
Yes, but let me say a couple of particular things about that are important to understand. Membership in CNI is institutional. Institutions make a commitment to CNI and are typically represented by, the institutions are typically represented by a very small number of people, most commonly two, in leadership roles in the institution. Typically, one of them is the head of the library operations. The other might be a CIO, a head of research computing, conceivably a chief research officer. We're finding, we're getting more engaged with those folks as time goes on. And we really very deliberately limit the attendance at CNI meetings to a very small number of reps per institution, typically two plus speakers, if any. So we keep the meetings small, exactly to facilitate that sort of thing. But backing that up, we make a great effort to capture a lot of what goes on in the meetings in video and make that broadly available to our members and the broader community. So what we do gets a good deal of dissemination at many of our members' institutions beyond the actual meeting.
Sounds like a good formula. Clearly, it seems to be working. Can we move on to, you've mentioned this Carnegie Mellon collaboration. Can we move on to some of the current issues that your members are facing? And of course, you'll know all these topics. One of the big ones is open access, and you mentioned before that open access, the societies and their sort of fragile economics. Open access is sort of seems to some societies to sort of be like a sort of a dagger to the heart. To the kind of operation that they've traditionally carried on. So what's your view, looking at the position of open access in the US? You're familiar with the OSTP, the Nelson Memo, the move towards more immediate deposit and availability. Do you think the guidance is going to have the desired effect?
So this is a complicated area, and as I think you correctly suggest there, it's one that is the specifics of which are playing out very differently in different geographical regions. So the situation in Europe, in the UK, in Latin America, very different. And as far as publications, journal articles and things like um, this is really not on the top of our list. There are a lot of other organizations who are involved in this now, advocating for it, trying to sort out the economic models. And it's not clear to me that, we add an enormous amount of value there. So we have certainly, disseminated information about the policies and you know, talked through some of the, very real mechanical issues of trying to get in compliance with those. For example, this whole question of, how federal funders actually keep track of whether the papers were indeed deposited where they were supposed to, is a real nuisance for a lot of institutions and investigators. And the more we can figure out ways to, just make that run smoothly, the better, obviously, it is for everybody. I would say that there is quite a lot of momentum at this point behind the embargo-free federal deposit kind of models. And, as long as the funders remain resolute on that, which ultimately, is a political process that I'm not going to try and call the outcome of at this point. I think we will see a steady move towards more and more material being deposited embargo-free. I think it is important to note that, at least in the US, I don't think that repositories, other than the repositories that are specifically identified by the federal agencies as depository repositories, if you will,
Yep.
are going to be playing a very big role in that. I think that situation is very different in some other countries, but I think that for whatever reasons in the US, they've chosen not to emphasize institutional repositories as a key part in that. I think that preprint repositories are kind of an underestimated factor in here as well. I mean, I continue to just be astounded by the reach and impact of the archive at Cornell, for example.
Yeah.
It's just an essential sort of thing at this point. So those are a few thoughts on that. I would say that we are paying, I mean, one of the things, again, going back to sort of the longer view of CNI and its role, you will find that back, 20 years ago, when open access was a very novel idea in most quarters, we were paying a good deal more attention to that and getting our members up to speed. But a number of more specialized and more focused, in organizations have come in to do that, and we're always happy to relinquish, the territory to those kinds of organizations. For data sets and research data management, I would say that we are still more engaged.
Yeah.
And we're watching quite carefully the policy pronouncements coming out of OSTP and the federal agencies in that area, as well as other developments. But even there, we are, I would say, certainly less heavily involved particularly in the details,
Mm-hmm.
than we were 10 years ago. And we've seen, a number of organizations come in who have a very specific focus there.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps you're saying that in some respects, open access is kind of a battle won, but when you look at something like research integrity, which is like almost like a sort of side effect of open access, that seems to be a growing and rather disturbing problem. When you look at the number of
Very
retracted
much so.
articles, so what's your take on that?
I think we've clearly got several different problems going here, and they are serious. Um, I I think there's an adjacent set of issues around research security, which often are mentioned in the same breath, where people speak of research integrity and security, but I think that um, they actually are rather different issues, and it's helpful to separate them out. Having said that, um, I can't help but wonder, um, at times, at least in my more paranoid moments, whether some of these um, eruptions of large-scale problems in research integrity aren't don't have some roots in attempts to undermine more deliberately undermine the functioning of the research enterprise. You just have to wonder sometimes with things at this scale. I think we've got a major challenge right now around this research integrity issue in that nobody is eager to take responsibility for it.
Mm.
The universities want the publishers to do it. The publishers want the universities to do it. The government isn't sure what it wants. Sometimes, some days it wants to do it. Other days it wants the universities to do it. So I think one of the first prerequisites to really getting this cleaned up is going to have to be some consensus on locus of responsibility and roles.
Mm.
And I do believe that there are players, at least in the US federal government, who are making some effort to get those conversations happening, which I think just can't happen soon enough.
That's good news because it's always alarming when you read a succession of posts that all talk about it not being my problem and focusing the sort of
Yes. Yeah, and I read the same ones you do. It's just, ridiculous. I mean, I've seen some of these flow charts, you probably have too,
Mhm.
of how a research misconduct
Mm.
investigation proceeds and
Mm.
the various handoffs between government, university, and publisher,
Mhm.
and the constraints on those handoffs.
Mhm.
It's unbelievable.
Mm. But I think there are some obvious candidates for sort of rapid changes. I think that the journal special issue seems to me a very, very suspect kind of concept, which played
Yeah.
into the hands of many open access publishers because it was just so easy to implement. And when you read about thousands of special issues coming from one publisher in the space of 1 year, this is just getting ridiculous.
Although let me share the um, very connected dilemma that is very much on my mind, and I don't think has fully surfaced yet.
Mhm.
Although we got a good foretaste of it in the pandemic. So on the one hand, we have had a growing commitment for at least 25 years now to the use of preprints,
Mhm.
which I think are a wonderful thing
Mhm.
in that they vastly accelerate the growth of knowledge,
Mhm.
the speed of discovery. I
Mhm.
mean, they really do, in my view, make a difference.
Mhm.
And certainly we saw in the pandemic when, there was a great need for rapid dissemination, rapid discovery, rapid breakthroughs, a huge reliance on preprint servers, even in areas where disciplines and subdisciplines and contexts where before the pandemic, they were exceedingly reluctant to adopt preprints,
Mm.
uh, in part because they were preprints in areas that affected the decisions of policymakers and of practitioners
Mm-hmm.
who were not in a good position to independently make judgments about an unrefereed manuscript.
Mm-hmm.
So here we are now. We've got this research integrity problem,
Mm-hmm.
but we've also got a huge commitment to preprints, which I don't see reversing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we have a whole set of issues around junk science and similar things,
Mm-hmm.
which are not exactly research integrity problems. There's something, related to it, but not exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to need to, as a society, and this is not, something that the scholars can work out all by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
As a society, we're going to need to come to some kind of understanding about this situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned preprints and the remarkable success of Archive. One of the intriguing things about preprints, though, is that it has always been really quite subject specific. Archive is the real winner, and there's a whole host. There's a long tail of tiny subject specific preprint services that were set up in with lots of optimism and have never caught on the way that Archive is probably bigger than the next 10 repositories put together, the preprint repositories put together. So do you think that preprints are subject specific, or do you think the preprint model could work across the board in humanities and so on?
So I think humanities are much harder. Um, I think if we just limit ourselves to kind of STEM things, um, preprints ought to work across the board. Certainly the rate of adoption has been very different from one STEM discipline to the next, or even subdisciplines, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the trend is kind of inexorably towards adoption of these. And I think that in the biomedical sphere, the pandemic really helped break the
Yeah.
logjam quite a bit. Um, Humanities are, they're really different, and um, I'm not I'm not sure that preprints fit with the culture of all the disciplines in the humanities,
Mm-hmm.
especially given the emphasis on very long works and the lack of emphasis on sudden breakthroughs in many cases.
It could be a reason. Yes, absolutely. Certainly interesting. The difference in the
You know,
differences.
so much of what's in play
Mm.
in the humanities is a thoughtful critical analysis that is neither right nor wrong, but provides new insight.
Yeah,
And that's very different than, saying I have a proof of this theorem.
that's true. That's very true. Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about the other big topic of the present day, of course, is generative AI. And fascinatingly, I remember reading that your PhD was about information retrieval. And it seems like under generative AI, information retrieval may even be staging a comeback in that designing a prompt is something that you need a real skill to do to get the good response from your generative AI. So do you think there's still a place for information retrieval, or more of a place now that we have these wonderful OpenAI and Claude systems to work with?
Let's talk about this from a couple of perspectives. Um, the generative AI stuff that has been rolling out is very difficult to deal with, because on the one hand, it is a sort of a fascinating parlor trick that it produces sort of hard to predict behaviors that are fascinating. Um, in that sense, it reminds me a little bit. Do you ever, I'm sure you're familiar with the old system ELIZA that pretends to
Oh
be
yeah,
a
yeah, yeah,
psychoanalyst.
yeah.
And, back in distant historical times,
Mm,
that used to fascinate people
yeah, yeah.
too. They spent hours,
But,
talking
yes,
to it.
but
They
answers
couldn't
with a
believe
question.
it wasn't,
Yeah.
that it really didn't know anything.
Yes, but it says, "Why do you
Um,
think? Why do you say that?" And makes you think they
yeah,
understand what you've said.
you had the same public fascination with Google when it rolled out.
Mhm,
People were attributing, to Google an understanding of their innermost desires and fears, and all of the things that people had put on the internet in ways that simply weren't true. Now, so generative AI has and particularly these chatbots,
mhm,
has captured the public's imagination um, uh, in the same kind of way. However, um, we are extremely short on any kind of sensible uses for this. You're seeing some pushback on particularly generative AI now
mhm, mhm,
from some of the big investment houses. For example, there's a report out from Goldman Sachs about 10 days, 2 weeks ago,
mhm,
that basically makes the case that um, that the companies that are investing in this are not seeing much of a return on investment. If you look at things like the co-pilots that Microsoft has
mhm,
popularized,
mhm,
you're seeing very, very mixed results out of
mhm,
those
mhm,
in terms of things like code quality.
mhm,
Um, uh,
mhm,
I think that a very healthy dose of skepticism around
mhm,
specifically generative AI is
mhm,
indicated. Now, having said that, I think there's a lot of other stuff going
mhm,
on in AI
mhm,
and machine learning that is very powerful
mhm,
and very interesting and is already having a
mhm.
very large impact.
Yeah.
It's just, I'm not sure it's this generative AI thing that, is the shiny toy for the week for the public.
Yes. No, I agree with you. I'm an optimist because I've been involved in new technology for years and years, and so every piece of new technology I get excited by. But I do think there are. I think a classic example is, for example, finding peer reviewers. Finding a peer reviewer in a specialist topic is something that generative AI can do very well. What it can't do is get the recommended reviewer to agree to do the review. That's a separate problem, which though it maybe doesn't sort of solve all the world's problems, but it does sort of move us on in some quite clearly defined ways.
I think you'll see some of those. There's clearly some low-hanging
Yeah.
fruit, and I think some of it is very related to the kind of information retrieval themes you were talking about.
Hmm.
For example, summarizations
Yes.
of a collection of
Perfect.
documents,
Yeah.
certain kinds of, synthetic
Yep.
reviews, things like
Yep.
that.
Yeah.
I do expect we'll see,
Yeah. Yeah.
some early
Yeah, yeah, some
progress in
stages of the
those.
literature review, that sort of thing. Yeah. So you've mentioned a
Yes.
5-year cycle for the CNI, and I couldn't really talk to you about without asking you what your crystal ball sort of has lined up for what you think are the coming 5 years. I mean, what do you think are going to be the biggest issues in the next sort of cycle for your members? Where do you think the discussion's going to move on to?
Well, I think these cloud labs are going to be important.
Hmm?
And it's worth noting that NSF is starting to think about these now in a more serious way. So they're starting to have, one of the things that has been a great theme for NSF in particular in the States has been the ability to use the network to more widely distribute opportunities to participate in leading edge science. And you see that, for example, in the funding of institutions in states that don't get a lot of NSF money for high performance connections to their campuses. And then that suddenly gives them access to high performance computing resources around the country. You see this reflected in the work around the National AI Research Resource Program that's going on. I think you're starting to hear some talk about how cloud labs fit into this kind of model as well, or could fit in terms of democratizing access to leading edge scientific research beyond a very small number of very wealthy institutions.
Well, thank you very much, Clifford. It's been remarkable. It's been fascinating talking to you, and remarkable to hear your story, and to learn more about the Coalition for Networked Information. And thank you for the time that you gave us to talk.
It's been great fun, and there's lots more to talk about. So let's find an excuse to do it.
Let's do it. Let's do another one. That sounds great. Let's come
All
back and talk
right.
some more. Thanks very much, then, Clifford. Thank you.